Welcome to Transformative Principle, Episode 16. I'm your host, Jethro Jones. You can find me on Twitter at Jethro Jones. Today we are interviewing Fidel Montero, who's the principal at Alta High School. We're going to talk mostly about his background today because it's pretty fascinating. He is the son of a migrant worker in California, and his experience growing up gave him a different lens through which to look at education, and he is super inspiring and a great human being. I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to interview him. I hope that you enjoy it today. We're going to touch on a lot of different topics. We're going to talk about how you can help your multicultural students regardless of what race you are, and how you can focus on engaging and supporting them. We're also going to talk about Fidel's work with Greta Pruitt in Los Angeles Unified School District, where he was tasked with bringing together African American parents and Latino parents and helping them work together. Really fascinating stuff. I hope you enjoy it. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, SaneBox, for supporting us. Go to sanebox.com or click on the link in the show notes and you can start a free trial to that service. What that service does is it takes the insanity out of your email and helps you focus on the emails that you need when you need them. Sign up for a trial. You can know that SaneBox cares about your privacy and does not let your emails touch their server. Only your headers go there, which is geek speak for your email stays with you, doesn't get transferred over to them.
You know what I did for my dissertation? Because I did a lot of interviews. I just used my iPhone. And then I uploaded the file to a software that transcribes, that helps you to transcribe the data. And then from the transcription, then I used another software called NVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software.
NVivo?
Okay. So it's like Excel for words.
That sounds pretty good. What was the software you
transcription? Gosh, I'd have to look it up.
Drag and Dictate, that's a popular one.
I gotta look it up. I can't remember. It was pretty slick in that once you had your audio file, then you just designated what keys you were going to use to play and stop. So instead of needing a foot paddle like the old school way, you just, hit like the arrows here, right?
Okay.
It was pretty cool.
All right. I've used a program like that, but I use the number keys up top.
Yeah, sure.
And that would do play or stop or whatever.
Yeah, same thing.
Cool. So then you did the transcription yourself?
I did, and the reason why is because all my interviews were in Spanish. I interviewed Latino parents. Mm-hmm. So, I just felt more comfortable doing it myself. Although that's a lot of work.
I believe that.
Yeah, it's a lot of hours of transcribing.
Yeah, I've tried transcribing things, and it just takes
time.
So much time. Mm-hmm. I met a stenographer, though, and she can type as fast as people can speak, sometimes even faster. And she does closed captioning for the church's broadcasts. Mm-hmm. And I watched her type on her little special keyboard, and it was amazing.
Really?
Oh, it was so cool. Because as somebody was talking, she would just... Yeah. It was like playing the piano is what it looked like. The way her fingers were moving, and there's only 2, I think, rows on a stenographer's keyboard. And it just looked cool. It was really neat. She was so fast, it was unreal.
Yeah, so you can use somebody like that and pay them, whatever they charge.
Yeah.
It might be worth it. Might be worth it, though. I'm telling you.
So what was your doctorate in? What were you doing the research?
Well, so my overall doctorate was a management doctorate, right? The emphasis, and managing urban school districts. So it was the urban superintendency program, is the name of the program. Mm-hmm. My particular emphasis was on how school districts that have changing demographics modify their practices to meet the needs of those incoming immigrants, right? So especially Latino parents, that was my emphasis. But I did it from the standpoint of the parents, not the school system.
So their perspective on what?
Yeah, what did the school do for you? How did they adopt? How did they modify their practices? That kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So what were the big takeaways from that? I know you did a ton.
Well, there were several, right? I mean, several themes. I mean, lots of themes that came out. I mean, depending on the parents' sort of social background, that had a big impact, right? So parents who came to the school systems with some sort of, social context or social capital from their former countries were able to navigate the systems much better, right? There were isolated, pockets of success that did things really cool. I mean, there was like one element or middle school that deliberately recruited Spanish-speaking parents to sit on their school community council, right? And they provided translators for them, and the parents were really part of the decision-making process at this school in a very meaningful way, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I remember going to one of their meetings, and this one parent, they were allocating money, right, that the school had, and this parent was like, no, we got to allocate money to have, like a parent advocate for Latino parents at the school, right? And this, here's this immigrant parent, didn't speak English, but yet she was impacting, how the school allocated like $30,000, right? So that was pretty, that was an example of the type of advocacy that schools have the capability of doing. But unfortunately, this particular school district didn't have necessarily systems in place that were implemented across the board, right? It was more isolated success, right, here and there. So
right. So was that then a principal who was taking the lead and charge of doing that?
Yeah. Yep.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, in that sense, it was right. The principal was really the one. It was a woman in this case. She was doing some good work.
Mm-hmm. And how much of the parent success was dependent on the principal's efforts to involve them?
Well, it was huge. I mean, the correlation, at least from the study. I mean, my study was a qualitative study, right? So, I can't extrapolate beyond the small group that I observed, right? But the impact of the principal made a tremendous difference, right? And the staff and the type of staff that they had at the school, right? So, down to the secretaries, the counselors, if they had the right people in those positions, those schools were a lot more capable of working with Latino families, right? Mm-hmm. And they just, there was a more welcoming, environment. Those type of employees took a more, proactive role in supporting Latino families. Schools that didn't hire with that, perspective tended to, at least the parents, from the parent standpoint, they didn't quite, feel the same level of care, right, that these other schools who were intentional and deliberate about servicing them.
Yeah. So what I'm not hearing you say, but I think you're implying, is that it may not be necessary for a person in those positions to speak Spanish, but that they have to.
No, it was more of this idea, this role, right, of being, taking more of an advocacy, approach and being deliberate. I mean, the schools that were deliberate about serving the Latino families were really the ones that were being successful. They, it was interesting because some schools sort of justified, well, we treat all our kids the same. We treat all our kids equal. And, sometimes equal doesn't, it means different things, right? So anyways, yeah. So, but it didn't necessarily take a Spanish speaking, person, right? I mean, like this principal, she didn't speak Spanish. It was just more of her. That was, something that she really felt compelled to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm at a Title I elementary school. We have a lot of Hispanics in our school, and I've tried to learn some Spanish, but I'm not proficient yet by any means. But I feel that helps engender me to those parents. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel that I have to know Spanish for them to trust me.
And they pick up on that, and that was, those were other themes that surfaced, right? Parents pick up on who's actually trying to be supportive and who's not, and who's, because in some instances there were people who spoke Spanish in the schools who really gave them a cold shoulder, right? And so it wasn't necessarily just about being able to speak a common language. I mean, certainly most people who spoke Spanish at schools were sympathetic and supportive, right? Mm-hmm. But it was more about the attitude that the schools took. Mm-hmm. It's more of a cultural sort of, element, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, what you're probably discovering with as you're studying different leadership, attitudes and approaches, right? It really comes down to the type of culture that's being built, right?
Absolutely. It's been fascinating to me to see how impactful that is. And everyone so far that I've spoken to has all agreed that it's all about the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And until you have that culture in place, none of the changes or successes that you're looking for are going to come because of what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, the greatest plan, the greatest strategy, the greatest innovation, right? But if there's not trust, if there's not, a sense of common, ideals, you're not going to get any of the other stuff done.
Right. Yeah.
Which, when you look at what we're doing collectively as a school district, right? And you look at our efforts through that lens,
right?
Especially since we're such a new district, right? It's an interesting paradigm, right?
Absolutely.
To consider.
Yeah. And if we didn't feel like we could make those changes at the school level because we didn't have the support from the district to make those changes, we'd never be able to do that.
Right.
And I think that's really important. Tell us where you did your research for your doctorate. What areas did you
I did, which demographical areas?
And geographic areas also.
So I did it here. I did it locally, and I wanted to do it here. I mean, I went to school in New York. I don't know if you knew that, but when I did my study, I wanted to do it in Utah because Utah's an interesting place, right? Demographically, it's going through. It's one of the fastest growing states as it relates to Latinos, and in the Western United States, right? So it's going through this really incredible demographic shift. So that was really appealing. Obviously, the fact that I lived and worked in Utah was interesting, but I really felt that Utah could really stand to make changes and learn from what other states have done and not done, right? So that's why I wanted to do it here locally.
Gotcha. So all the families you interviewed were all here in Utah?
They were all here, and they all varied. They all had children. I made sure that when I did my selected, who was participating, that I had people represented who had children at all levels, right, at the elementary, middle school, and high school level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for a principal who is a principal of a school that has a growing or large or small Latino population, what would be some advice for how to establish that culture that's accepting and inviting, specific strategies they could use to do that?
Specific strategies. I think your hiring practices are crucial, right? So, making sure that you're hiring the right person when you're going through that process. And I think hopefully you have a way of identifying, the right fit, right, of candidates to work in a Title I school, to work in a school that's, highly impacted, socioeconomically, or, who has a high number of, students of color. So I think that's huge, right? Whether it's your custodian, whether it's your librarian, your secretary. I think your hiring practice have a great deal with the type of culture you're establishing. I think another very specific thing that you could do is the type of workshops, the types of conversations that you're having as a faculty, because if you're going to be deliberate, right, about serving Latino students, I think you need to make sure, hey, whenever you have those conversations, as a large group, that you're deliberate about saying, hey, you know what, at this school, man, we're going to make sure that we're servicing, of course, all of our kids, but that we're paying extra close attention to our, students of color, our Latino students, right? I think you got to address, especially if you have, what faculty that hasn't turned over, and faculty who has seen the school change demographically, right? I mean, that's one of the kind of interesting scenarios that I'm sure you're going through, right? Where you have a teacher who started at Copper Hills or Copperview when Copperview was 90% Caucasian, and now it's, sort of shifting within their own tenure as teachers. I think, doing some specific trainings with them, right? About, what is a microaggression, right? And how do you make sure that you don't belittle kids, because they are, Latino or Spanish speaking. How do you build on the cultural the cultural assets that they're bringing to the table and really value those things, right? So I think those are all things that you can be very deliberate about and train teachers. And in fact, in some ways, it's interesting because as a non-Latino, I think you're positioned in an interesting way that might make the conversation a little easier than if if I was the principal at Cop Review, right, and being a Latino myself, for principals of color, it's an interesting paradigm to balance, right? It's kind of, this whole idea. I don't know if you've, cued into, Barack Obama speaking about race, right? I mean, there's some real interesting, dichotomies and challenges that come with that territory. So I think as a non-Latino, right, I think you could even be a more forceful advocate than perhaps, I could, right? Because if I have to be not subtle, but I have to really be conscious of what I'm saying and doing, because then you don't want to become, people label you right away as the, okay, well, this guy's the militant, Latino principal who only cares about Latinos, right? Right. Does that make sense? So it's an interesting paradigm, right, to consider.
It sure is. And I've thought a lot about that myself, about how I can include those people without being degrading to them, because I could, if I say you need my help to be a part of the school more than these other kids, I could see how that could be taken offensively as well. What are some ideas you have for me in that situation to be to take those opportunities to reach out to them? What advice would you give?
So let me make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. You're wanting just some advice in terms of reaching out to Latino families, but not doing it in a way that's condescending, sort of? Is that am I understanding your question correctly?
Well, you said that you'd have challenges as a Latino yourself, reaching out to them.
Well, not necessarily reaching out to the families. I'm talking about training your teachers, right?
Oh, I see. Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because you were asking me about things that you could do now to support it. So I talked about your hiring practices and then your trainings and the conversations you're having with your faculty, right? Because in terms of me making connect, I mean that comes sort of naturally, right?
And that's where my confusion was.
That comes sort of naturally. I was talking about you having dialogue with your faculty.
That makes sense. Okay, we're on the same page now. Thanks. So I see what you're saying, especially now, much better. Thanks for clarifying that for me. What are some of the specific things that you could teach teachers about? You mentioned microaggression. Can you explain what that is a little bit?
I mean, cultural competencies, helping your teachers really so that they can see especially if we're talking about Latino students, right? So they can see them with a lens of, empowerment, right? Or with a lens of, hey, you know what? These kids are actually pretty darn smart kids, pretty bright kids who have a great deal of potential, as opposed to looking at them as, kids who are not going to achieve at the same level as others because of their backgrounds and so forth, right? So you want teachers to change their paradigm about what Latino kids are bringing to the table, right? The fact that they're bilingual, man, view that as the ultimate, asset, right? As opposed to, and I don't know if this goes on in your school or not, right? But I mean, I think, in my experience, there's a lot of times where Latino parents feel that, hey, you know what, this school doesn't value my culture, doesn't value my language, right? And that sort of automatically creates a barrier between them, right? So if the school is really deliberate about saying, if teachers, right, see what the cultural experience that the kids have, the language, background that they have, if they view those things as assets that these kids can then utilize in the future to be successful, I think that's going to come through, right? And the kids are going to pick up on that. But if the message that the kid is getting from the school is that, hey, you know what, it's not cool to speak English, right? Or Spanish, a second language, or, that it's not cool to value the fact that I'm a, Mexican American, a Latino, whatever, right? I think if the school sends the wrong message, then I think that's going to be problematic, right? So, things that you can do in the classroom, right? I mean, I think if the teachers, can infuse into their curriculum, certain characteristics that the kids are going to value, that they're going to recognize, without necessarily disrupting. I know teachers really worry about their curriculum, right? But if they perhaps infuse a book, that highlights Latino characters, right? If they point out, certain, holiday traditions, if they point out certain things that when the Latino kid sees it, they're like, whoa, this is cool, man. We're celebrating what it means to be Latino, not just on one day on Cinco de Mayo, right? But we're actually valuing things that are connected to literacy, right? That are connected to mathematics, that are connected to science, right? And I think some teachers, fear that, hey, by doing that, am I, not teaching these kids to be American, right? Or whatever. And I don't think those two things are necessarily conflicting, ideas, right? But I think if a kid can feel a sense of worth, a sense of value about their cultural heritage, I think they will adopt, American ideals even stronger, right? Mm-hmm. Because when they feel rejected from the American system, right, that's when they really turn away from those American ideals.
Mm-hmm. And did you see evidence of that when you were interviewing the families?
Well, I just saw that in my own upbringing. I saw that in my own upbringing. And I did see it with some of the families that I spoke to. Absolutely.
Tell me a little bit more about that, either yourself or the families you saw.
Well, just, I saw it both in my own personal experience. I saw it as a teacher, I saw it as a vice principal, right? When kids felt, hey, this institution, this teacher values who I am, right? As a Latino, they really felt more of a connection with those people, right? When they didn't feel that same sense of welcome or that same sense of, hey, you know what? I'm not going to get on your case if you speak Spanish in my class, right? They felt connected with those teachers, right? But when they felt that the teachers were not valuing those assets, then that's when you had a lot of tension, right?
Right.
And again, I saw that I've seen that since, I was a student and as a teacher and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And, we're talking right now about Latinos, but those same things can happen if anybody's culture is not respected.
Right. Absolutely. And I think if we weren't so homogeneous here in Utah, we'd be talking about, or I bet if you go and you talk to families who've immigrated from Greece, from, Central Africa. We have a lot of refugee families here in Utah from these different countries, right? Yeah. But my guess is that you would find some similar themes.
Yeah. So we had a student who had immigrated as a refugee from Africa, and he saw shame in speaking French. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was because of something that had happened at school or if he just felt like that was so different.
Yeah, see, and when you get a kid like that, man, holy cow, we're like, hey, that's awesome, man. Yeah. Celebrate it, and say, hey, let's add to that, man.
Yeah.
But somehow kids do get that message, mm-hmm. and it could be little smart remarks that a teacher makes. When I describe microaggressions are certain behaviors that we do that belittle another person's, background or culture, right? And people do it subtly. They're not these abrupt, outrages, right? Where somebody, yells out profanity at somebody because, of their race or their, ethnicity and so forth. But microaggressions are more things like, can I give you an example of something? I don't know, calling a kid, asking the kid to stop speaking Spanish because, X, Y, and Z, right?
Right.
And just little things like that, that a teacher might say or that an adult might say, mm-hmm. That impacts, how the person's perceiving themselves.
Yeah. So, we live in an era where we need to be politically correct and all that. And so sometimes we feel like to prevent being rude or disrespectful mm-hmm. or condescending to a person, we don't say anything at all. And there needs to be that balance between stopping inappropriate behavior at school, regardless of what's going on, and targeting. That's not the best word, but focusing those things on a person's culture. And so if a student is calling another student names, whatever language it's in, that's inappropriate.
Yeah, right.
And so So what advice do you give to teachers on how to deal with those types of situations and how to deal with negative behavior regardless of the language and not make it about the student's cultural heritage?
Yeah, so I think those types of things boil down to the type of relationship that the teacher has with a kid, right? And I mean, I think if a student feels, that a teacher doesn't care about them, they're going to feel picked on regardless of whether the kid is Latino or not, right?
Right.
So if a teacher has a relationship with the child, I think they're able to help them, navigate those experiences when the kid, gets in trouble and messes up and, does something that they shouldn't.
Right. And perhaps they need to work a little bit harder with those cultural
absolutely. It's so much easier to get to know those that you have things in common with, that you're more comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just sort of, human nature. So, but I think if those teachers take an extra effort, right, to make a connection with kids who might be a little different than them, I think kids pick up on that, and they're not, they're smart. They can pick up on, when a teacher sort of tolerates them versus when a teacher really embraces them and likes them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Let's change gears a little bit and talk about the work that you did with Greta Pruitt.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Dude, I love Greta. She was, she's an angel, man. She was one of my mentors. And I think she was, when I first met her, she had just completed being senior administrator in Los Angeles Unified. And she was doing school reform work here in the state of Utah. So she was, she ran a consulting firm out of Los Angeles. It's called the Urban Learning Centers, and they had a partnership with the Los Angeles Educational Partnership, who worked directly with LA Unified. And what they did was that they would go into schools, help them go through restructuring, help them go through a series of evaluations to identify areas of strength, areas of need. And anyway, so they had a whole framework that they utilized. And Greta was, she was the CEO, general manager, right, of this organization. And when I was going through college, I was working at an elementary school, and who was actually one of the, it was a Title I school in Provo called Timpanogos Elementary. And Greta happened to be doing like a site visit because the school was adopting their model. And they, I think, and John, that's where I first met John. He was, involved in that whole process. And anyway, so I met Greta in the hallway, and we talked, and she was like, hey, why don't you come out and do an internship and come work for us? And, I went out to California and started working with Greta. At the time, I was studying economics. I didn't have any plans of going into education, but that internship seemed intriguing enough that I went out there. And while in Los Angeles, Greta was a huge mentor, big mentor to me. And she's part of the reason why I did go into education.
Mm-hmm. So what kinds of things were you doing in your internship then?
So what I did, my specific responsibilities were to, I got assigned to work at Compton High School, Budlong Elementary in South Central, Pacoima Elementary in the San Fernando Valley in Pacoima. So my responsibility kind of varied a little bit in each school, but I had to develop a curriculum to teach parents, right, and to help parents kind of come together and work together, especially African American and Latino parents who really were at odds, for various, reasons in Compton and in South Central. And I think a lot of it had to do with the demographic shifts that those places were going through at the time, and I think are continuing to go through, where you had predominantly African American communities who were now changing rapidly by the influx of Latino immigrants. So, I was supposed to go in there and get these parents to talk to each other and to work together. And I did it through these language classes, this language curriculum that I organized, where the African American parents were learning Spanish and the Spanish speaking parents were learning English. Mm-hmm. So we sat down, we talked about language, we talked about race, we talked about, all kinds of fun stuff. And so that was kind of my role, And then in addition to that, I obviously participated in what the actual that the Urban Learning Center model was actually doing and helping schools go through this, renew or reform school improvement process.
Right. And so what things did you take away from that led you to your doctorate at Columbia?
Wow. So what did I take away from my internship? Well, I think working in Los Angeles, working in those, it doesn't get any more inner city than Compton, right? Mm-hmm. Or South Central. I think it really got me to think about, what contributions I can make to the field of education and to specifically, to those types of, circumstances, right? So it obviously impacted my decision to go into education, right? I chose to go into teaching and change my major and all that because of what I was experiencing and what I saw there. I think early on, that experience really helped me to look at schools differently and helped me to look at schools through the lens of school improvement, as before I even declared a teaching major. So it helped me to say, hey, you know what? Schools don't have to be failing, and they don't have to be struggling, and they can do certain things and apply certain principles so that they can serve kids who come from very difficult backgrounds, but help them to be successful, right? And it sort of gave me a framework that I then, when I went and actually started teaching, right, it sort of influenced my teaching. And when I went back to get my master's and my doctorate, that, those sort of lessons or principles that I picked up, as an intern or as, and I became an employee of the organization, right? So those things really stuck with me, right? And I still look at the world of, school improvement as through those lenses. So it's kind of interesting because when we as a district call a school improvement plan a school improvement plan, to me, school improvement has more of a different meaning, right? Than putting together a paper like the one we just, the exercise that we go through every year,
right?
Where we set goals for reading, goals for science, and then that feels more like a dog and pony show, right? Mm-hmm. To me, school improvement is actually going into a school and assessing, okay, where are you at with your teaching and learning, right? What type of things are going on? What are you implementing? And you really assess, right, what you're doing from a teaching standpoint, and then you're looking at what's your management structure like, and how are you making decisions that impact your teaching and learning, and what is your management policies and so forth, and then you got the whole parent support component, right? So that when I think of school improvement, I look at it through that lens as opposed to a single plan that you fill out, and
more like an overhaul and looking at everything
absolutely
that you're doing throughout the entire school and not leaving any stone unturned.
Absolutely. It's it's really remodeling a home as opposed to painting it, right, with a fresh coat of paint,
right,
but actually knocking down walls and removing floors, removing carpets, moving bathrooms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. I've never thought of it like that. Our school is in a school in improvement right now, and that's why John has been working with us, and so that's been my exposure to it as well. And so the CSIP plan that we do seems, like you said, like painting walls fresh,
And I don't, not to be critical of it. That's, people put on the table what they have context for, right? Mm-hmm. And if you haven't been exposed to that type of real sort of, I think we have elements of it, right? Like I think what EBL is trying to do with really impacting, teaching behavior and, our practices in the classroom, I think that's certainly an element of school improvement, right?
Yeah.
But, we don't really have a framework by which we are evaluating how we're implementing that. We don't have a decision-making model. We don't have we kind of do. I think we're getting there. I think we're taking the right steps,
right?
But, we have a ways to go.
Yeah, totally. And I've always thought that education should be more focused on each individual student being successful and what that particular student can do. And, when my oldest daughter, who has Down syndrome, started getting involved with the school, then I learned as a parent rather than as a teacher about what IEPs really mean.
Yeah, isn't that insightful?
Yeah, it was amazing. And so I feel like what would be really beneficial for schools is for every school to have an IEP for themselves or a school improvement plan.
Absolutely.
And not the one you do every year, but the big one that we've been going through, and the things we've learned about ourselves and about our students and families. All that has been very transformative and made us, I think, a lot better overall.
So yeah, we can talk about, days about, my experience in Los Angeles and so forth, but.
That was a great interview with Fidel Montero. That was just the first part. Make sure you tune in next week for the second part. It's going to be great. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about the interviews that I'm doing, or hear some recommendations that you have. Feel free to give me a shout out on Twitter at Jethro Jones, or send me an email at jethrojones@gmail.com. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, SaneBox, and thank you so much for listening. If you'd like, please go rate the song in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, and follow Transformative Principal on Twitter or on Facebook.